Well, welcome to Journey. My name is Jamie. I'm one of the pastors here. A couple of things as we get started. I just want to give you a couple quick announcements, and then we're going to jump in on our fourth Sunday on this series on the Bible called Anthology. So a couple of opportunities. First, I've mentioned this before, and you heard the ladies mention it, but we're heading to Brazil in January. And if you go, hey, it's been a long time since I've been in another culture, kind of outside my own, and man, I really miss being in that other kind of a context and serving people, especially people who are in need, kind of in desperate places. We'd love to have you. If you go, yeah, that actually terrifies me, I'm really into my own comfort zone and I don't want to go to another place, we'd love to have you too. Maybe it'd be good for you. And if you love kids, we're going to go do orphan care. And so Susie and I are leading the trip. We'd love to have you. There's opportunity to join us. Second thing, if you are a guy, we're looking for some male leaders in our youth ministry. So middle school, high school, we still need some male leadership there. And so if you had a horrible adolescence and you'd like to redeem that, no, we need some men that want to hang out with our teenagers. They're doing a Stranger Things kind of weekend coming up this weekend. It'd be a great chance to kind of get to know them, hang out. But if you're interested, talk to Rob or Shane. And if you don't know them, you can email them, Rob or Shane at journeytn.com. But we'd love to get you plugged in. And then the third thing is our church is growing, and as Kevin keeps reminding me, when this place is somewhat functional, it's going to continue to grow. And so we're trying to get ahead of it and really work on our systems. You've heard us say a lot of Journey. It's never okay for people to be numbers. People are people, and they have names and they have stories, and everything about our culture is to preserve that. So as we scale and we have systems and processes of organization, that's really important to us. One of the things we're realizing is pretty quickly we're going to have to kind of take all the areas of ministry and all the areas of operations and put them in two categories. Kevin's kind of overseeing both, and we'll restructure it a little bit, but Kevin's going to continue on in operations, and there are a number of things we're going to have to look forward to as we grow that he's going to need to really give time to. So we're looking for someone to be an executive pastor of ministry. So if you or you know someone who's had ministry experience that you think might fit at Journey, yeah. That's pretty funny. The first response was like, mm-hmm. We are an unusual place with an unusual group of people. If you're new here, this is a motley crew. And we're a mutt. We really are. Like we've imported lots of traditions and lots of experiences. We all come from different backgrounds, and so it is kind of a unique culture. And so if you know somebody you think might make sense to them, we'd love to meet them. So just email Kevin, let him know. Some recommended reading. I've been doing this each week. Just give you, for those of you who like to read, want to drop in a little bit deeper, 3 reads. Number 1, Neil Lightfoot. He wrote a book called How We Got the Bible. This is pretty academic, but if you're like, I'd just like a little bit more information on just how was the Bible formed, that's Neil Lightfoot's book. Another book, How to Think by Alan Jacobs. This is a great book. It's especially in kind of today's political climate. It's really interesting on the structure of thinking. Another book, Things Hidden by Richard Rohr. If you want to do the deep dive into the Bible, this is a wonderful book about interpreting the Bible and understanding Scripture. Fantastic book. Those are my 3 recommended reads. Here we go. Now, I'm going to open up with not a parable, but an interpretation of a parable. A parable is a short story often told by Jesus in the Bible. And so we're going to start by reading Jesus' interpretation of the parable. But let me give you an idea where we're going. And we're going to talk about genres of the Bible. In other words, when you read the Bible, it's actually written kind of in different sections. And there are different ways you read each genre. And this is going to be interesting, especially depending on how you were kind of taught to read the Bible. Then we're going to get to translations. And I'm going to give you a quick historical timeline. I got to burn through it because we don't have a lot of time. And it's a historical timeline on how we got the Bible. For those of you who love history, you're going to love today. For those of you that hate history, you're going to love today. Here's what I want you to do. Those of you like, I'm not really into history. Here's what I want you to do. Think of it like a story, because as I give you the time, once we're going to do genres first, but once we get to translations, think of it like a story. And I want you, when you're watching a film, your body naturally, when you're listening to a story, you naturally go ahead in the story and anticipate what you think the outcome will be. That's what we do when we listen to stories. Like, oh, I wonder if it's going to be. So when I'm giving you the history, so that if you hate history and you don't like information, so that you're not bored, pay attention, because there's a theme that will emerge while I'm giving you the history of how we got the Bible, okay? So that's for my non-history people. You ready? That's where we're going today. First, we're going to start out with this passage in Scripture because it kind of sets up how we understand the Bible. Matthew chapter 13, verse 18. Jesus is speaking. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. He doesn't do this a lot, very rarely actually, but he gives an explanation of this parable. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. He's going to talk about 4 different kinds of soil, or 4 different places where the seed fell. That's the first. The second, the seed falling on rocky ground, refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. And when you hear word, he's talking about this teaching. They hear this teaching that God is love, that God is going to redeem them, that he's going to restore all things. They hear it, and there's this joy, like, yes, I want to be in. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Seed falling among the thorns refers us to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word and make it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil, now pay attention to that phrase, good soil, refers to someone who hears the word and understand it. Good soil, hears, understands. Those are the trifecta. I want you to just pay attention to that. Those 3 phrases. Here's the word, the good soil, hears the word, understands it. This is the one, by the way, what happens with that person? Well, they produce a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. There's this massive reproductive activity in their life. There is this fruit that emerges. There's a crop. And clearly it's not just for one person, so it's sustenance for all. Something happens to this person who is good soil. Jesus uses the phrase here. He uses the word in the front end and then in the back end, this word understand. Hears and understand. What does it mean to understand a teaching? Now, here's what I want to say. Some of us, for understanding, it's all in the mind. And some of you you might even describe yourself as, I'm kind of a head guy, or I'm the kind of person who just loves to be stuck in their head. As a matter of fact, sometimes people tell me, man, you don't have any feelings. You need to feel something. Get in your heart, but you just love your head. A lot of times when we think understanding, we think head. I gotta grasp this thing. I think in this parable and in other parables that Jesus tells, I actually think the narrative arc of Scripture is that understanding happens with more than just our head. It involves the head, but there's more to it. Alan Jacobs, I think, captures this beautifully. He says this: the analytical mind constantly separates, divides, distinguishes, until its whole mental world lies in pieces around it. Ever had that experience, by the way? My head people? I'm one of these people. I can analyze so much that my brain is, literally my head is hurting me. Like, I'm in pain. Now, usually my wife picks up on this before I do, and then asks me questions like, well, what are you feeling? To which I usually have no idea. And I'll have to literally, if you were like, hey, Jamie, what's one thing you're working on in your life right now? Well, I'm working on feeling stuff in the moment. I'm great at feeling what everybody else feels. You Enneagram people, I'm a 3, so I can feel what everybody else is feeling, but I have trouble feeling what I'm feeling. So this is one of my spiritual practices. I have to really pause and go, what am I feeling? What am I feeling? Oh, this is so hard. What am I feeling? I have to really, it's a different kind of work. I'm exercising different muscle. Well, listen to the back end of what Jacob says. He says, and where will that mind that's just broken everything apart and has it all over, like Legos, all over the floor? I've just analyzed this whole thing in my life. Those of you who are red people, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a completely dismantled Lego thing around you. But how do you put it back together? Where will the mind acquire the energy it needs to put things back together? In the cultivation of feelings. You actually can't fully pull it back into the whole without your feelings. Now, some of us import feelings even though we don't know we're importing feelings. It's just, some of us we're showing up with some anger or resentment. There's a low hum of stuff we don't even know about. We might even show up with some joy. We're not even aware of it. But feelings are happening, just whether or not we have a great awareness of them. He goes on to say the whole person has to be engaged. Head, heart, body, all the faculties present and accounted for in order for real thinking to take place. Let me give you an example. I opened up by mentioning Brazil. I said we're going to do some orphan care. Some of you in your mind might have gone, oh, that's good. Way to go. Trinity Church, we should do some stuff for orphan care. That's good. But you didn't feel it. You were like, I feel the weight of poverty. I'm thinking about what it's like for those kids who have no clean water. And let's say I want to introduce you to one of my friends. An open door opens, and one of my Brazilian friends walks up here, and it's a 25-year-old, and he says, I was dying. I was living in a garbage dump. I probably would have lived for another couple months when an organization found me, took me under their wing, clothed me, fed me, and educated me. Changed the trajectory of my life. Actually put me in a church. I learned about God. I learned skills to the point that I've actually moved to the United States and I started my own business here. I'm now a businessman and I just got married. My wife's pregnant with her first child. If that man got up and told that story, you'd probably feel something. Suddenly, the fact that someone's without food, that's just a head thing. Like, okay, yeah, we should do something. Now do you see the difference? Of just an acknowledgement and deep understanding. Understanding requires your heart. And in order for your heart to be engaged, it requires relationships. I'm tipping my hand to the trajectory of the entire message today. All right, before we get to translations, we're going to talk about genres, and I'm going to give you something super practical on how to approach the Bible. Now, this is in direct contrast with any of us that were taught to just read the Bible, and every time you read the Bible, you read it for personal application, which, for some of us, was problematic. Anyone ever read Leviticus? There are parts in Leviticus that talk at length about mold. There's some parts in Leviticus that talk at length about how a woman should handle her time of the month. I've not had a lot of personal application from that place when I'm reading. So when you read, if you go, well, every area of the Bible you're supposed to read with personal application. God wrote it for Jamie George in 2019. Read it and apply it. I think there's some well-meaning people that kind of taught us that's how we're meant to go to the Bible, but the problem is that the Bible just wasn't written that way. It was written with different genres, and we're meant to approach it different ways. And if we do, it will transform the way we interact with the Bible. So if you were just talking like that was kind of the one thing you did, I'm about to open a whole vista of opportunity for you. And the Bible could have a richness, and you could flourish in this thing like never before if you'll approach it in this way. So here are the genres. The first genre is narrative or historical. Some examples would be Exodus, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Ruth, in the New Testament, the book of Acts. These are history books. They're narratives. A narrative tells us what happened according to the purposes of the author or authors. In other words, they're trying to condense a whole lot of information to tell you a point. They say this part of history is important for you to know. Now, there might be a spiritual lesson from the event. We often can draw something from that, some principles. But sometimes it's just historical context for this grand story of God's people and his interaction with humanity. Second genre is poetry. Poetry is vivid, figurative language. It's heart language. When you go to read poetry, you come to feel. You don't read poetry with your head. If you tried that, read poetry with your head. Like, I'm going to analyze what they're saying right here. The green grass was wispy in the wind, and the sunlight bounced across the blades. Yes, what does that mean? I can figure that out. Sunlight meant... It's not how you read poetry. You're supposed to feel that. You're supposed to be in like, oh, I remember the time the sunlight bounced across the blades of grass. That takes me back. Like that's how you read poetry. You're supposed to feel something. So some examples. This is the book of Psalms. David writes a lot about his anger. God, kill my enemies. You might be like, yes, I feel that today. Totally know that feeling. Song of Solomon. If you're not married, maybe wait. If you are married, this is kind of an erotic book. You might feel some things you haven't felt in a while. It's good. Go read that. I forgot what that felt like. It's good. Spice up your marriage. Wisdom. It's 11:30, sorry. I got Kevin in my ear going, bring it. Okay. Wisdom. Wisdom books. These are wise sayings that help shape morality and behavior. If you were with us this summer, we did a whole series on human behavior. So they're wisdom books. Like, this is how you shape your morality. These are some good behaviors. If you do this, it's going to generally help you in life. Wisdom. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, examples. Prophecy. Prophecy books are where we gain spiritual lessons from those who are writing about the disposition of God as they understand him at that time. This is very important. So some examples here are Hosea, Jeremiah, Isaiah. And sometimes we read the Bible and we're like, well, I guess God is saying this because this is what he said to Isaiah. Well, this is what Isaiah is saying God said to Isaiah. And we're going to talk more about that in the future as we continue on in this series. But they're prophecy books. So this author is saying, this is how I understand the disposition of God. He's angry, he's tender, he's caring, he's indignant, he's full of wrath. It's they're expressing how they're experiencing God. If all of us, if I said, here's a piece of paper, I want you to write down yesterday how you experienced God. And we took all the pieces of paper and we put them together, we'd have a whole lot of different descriptions of the disposition of God. Just be a lot of variety. Would you go, that's exactly the nature of God? Maybe. But that's how these folks experienced God. But God, let's just be honest, we're talking about the deep mystery, the God of the universe. It's kind of a little bit like going, hey everybody, let's go to the Pacific Ocean, you all get a cup. Take your cup in the water, taste it. What's God like? Good, describe that. How much of the ocean did we cover right there? There's a whole lot more about God that's not covered by your cup of water. So just when you're reading prophecy books, go, okay, this is Hosea, this is Jeremiah. They're writing about God as they know him, and they're explaining how they are experiencing God interacting with humanity. All right, next genre, the Gospels. These are the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, these are similar to the genres of narrative or biography, but they're more than that because the gospel, actually the term is proclamation. It's dynamic news. It's dynamo. They actually stole the word. It was a common everyday word being used because they used it for the Romans all the time. Like, hey, there's great news. General so-and-so just kicked the butts of another Germanic tribe, and they're going to come in town and do a parade this week. Woo, gospel. Like that's where they got the word. So the gospel is this proclamation of this great news. And so what are the 4 gospels? The people who wrote them were true believers relating firsthand accounts about the life and teachings of Jesus. Jesus, who is God, that ocean we were talking about, incarnated into man. Jesus is the display of God on the planet as a man. So totally man, totally God, and the Gospels center on this. So you can read the Gospel like a faith document announcing a world-changing event centered on the person of Jesus. Now, there's a little subgenre that Jesus uses all the time called parables. Those are short stories. And what parables are typically used for is they're typically meant to provoke something. Usually it's because we've suppressed something, and the parable's meant to pull it up to the top. So, for instance, we talked about, like, I think if you interviewed anybody here, you'd go, hey, how we know we need to serve the poor. We need to care for the poor. Not only is that biblical, but it's human. How are we caring for people in need? But it's not always kind of top of mind. So it might be something we've kind of suppressed. Care for the orphan. Or how about this? Some of us might kind of have this low hum in the background, like, I'm probably a little greedy right now. Or I'm really preoccupied with money. But I don't really want to pay attention to that. Well, parables are really good at making them pop out in front of you. It's provocative. So Jesus tells a little short story because he's digging to go, what are you suppressing right now that you need to be aware of? That's what a parable is. So that's what they're good for. So when you're reading parables, read them like that. Like, ooh, is there something that's supposed to And by the way, it might happen. You're reading the parable and you're like, well, why am I really thinking about how I'm taking care of money right now? Oh, because that's what the parable was supposed to do. And you feel a little convicted, like, I guess I should give some attention to this. All right, two more genres. One is the epistles. So some examples of that are 1st and 2nd Timothy, Ephesians, Galatians. Most of these are letters. They're written to a person like Timothy or Philemon, or they're written to a church like the church in Corinth or the church in Thessalonica or the church in Galatia. Now this is really important because Paul, man, Paul wrote a lot of these letters, and Paul is really, really adored, or he really gets a hard time in the Christian church, has throughout all of Christian history. Scholars call these epistles, their letters, occasioned texts, meaning they were written by a real person to real people in a real place in real time for a specific occasion. This church is dealing with a thing, and Paul's like, well, we need to deal with the thing. Now, by the way, Paul is a human being who's writing from his perspective about the thing. This is fascinating. Take some time and read Paul's letters in the order of his ministry. Read how he writes one of the letters early on when he first starts, and listen to the tone of the letter, and then read his tone later on right before he dies. You're like, I think Paul's had a little spiritual maturity going on. One of his letters, he actually spends about 2 or 3 chapters just defending himself. And then he's qualifying, like, I don't know why I'm defending myself, but I'm going to defend myself. And then in the middle of it, he's like, I shouldn't even defend myself, but I'm going to defend myself. You're like, Paul's dealing with his ego in real time. If you're only reading for application, you're like, I guess I should defend myself, but tell people I shouldn't defend myself. Because that's what Paul did. No, it's just a person struggling with stuff while he's writing to other people. So these are the epistles. All right, circumstances. Significant occasions. All right, and then finally, apocalyptic literature. Examples of this are Revelation and Daniel. So apocalyptic literature is written as a highly symbolic form to evoke emotion. So apocalyptic literature is supposed to raise the horror of a situation and then plunge you into hope. Or, depending on who's writing, raise your hope and plunge you into horror. Like, it depends on who's writing it. In this case, in the Bible, it's used as horror that's meant to plunge you into hope. Now think about this for a second. Do you know there are people who go to horror movies? I'm sure no one here. But there are people who pay $16 in IMAX to place themselves in fear for 2 hours, to terrify themselves, to get their heart rate up and feel massive anxiety. They pay for this. What do you think about it? What are you doing? I'm going to go be horrified. I just want someone to terrify me. Okay. Now, there's a lot of psychology. I don't have time for all that, onto why we're doing that. But it's what's happening. Like, if there's this horror, and perhaps you walk out of the door and you're like, dear God, give me some popcorn. And I'm glad the world actually isn't falling apart, and there isn't a ghost here, or there isn't a zombie here, or there isn't some clown here, or whatever. That I'm actually going to go home and be, not die tonight. So there's hope, all right? But apocalyptic literature, it's supposed to evoke like that, like if you've ever seen a horror film, it's supposed to evoke that kind of emotion. Now, apocalyptic literature has an intended audience. John was writing to a real audience, and Daniel was writing to a real audience. But apocalyptic literature is in code. Why? Because in order to get the message to the real audience, you couldn't let another audience know what you were talking about. For John, he didn't want the Romans to know what he was talking about. So he wrote it with all his imagery so that they were like, what the heck are you talking about, horns and whatever? I don't know, just pass it on. So he literally had to, when he wrote his thing, John was exiled, and he was like, yeah, I wrote this story, would you pass it on to my people? And Romans are like, yeah, okay. Meanwhile, the people are like, whoa, the Romans are horrible. They're realizing, they're decoding. So apocalyptic literature needs to be decoded. You have to have a decoder. You have to find your own personal Indiana Jones to teach you how to decode. Now, once you figure out what the decoder is, it all kind of unravels pretty quickly. But you got to find out what that is. Apocalyptic literature. Okay, those are the genres. If you'll open up your Bible and first go, what genre am I in? It will change the way you interact with the Bible. God bless you. Am I supposed to go in to feel? Or am I supposed to go in to draw a spiritual lesson? Am I supposed to go in as an observer? How am I? Because if you had a book of poetry and you pulled that off the shelf, you would read it differently than if you pulled a history book off the shelf. You just read them differently. This is an anthology of books slapped into one, by the way. Before Christians, there wasn't really a book. There were scrolls that people read. Christians were the first people that were like, hey, those letters are so good, and I love these testimonials about what happened when Jesus walked the earth. Can we compile those? Yeah, and we'll put them on vellum or calfskin, and then, let's get like a piece of wood and put it on top, and a piece of wood and put it on the bottom, and let's create this thing. They called them codexes, and they began to put it together, and now you have this thing called books. That's where it came from. People compiling all these letters and poetry into one thing. Bible translations. You ready? Okay, remember those of you that don't like history, you're thinking ahead. There's a theme to be found. Those of you that enjoy history, this is fun. 283 AD, the Septuagint is written. For the first time, the entire Bible is compiled into one thing. Why does that happen? Because the king of Egypt, Ptolemy II, who was left there after Alexander, says, we got to fill the library in Alexandria, which was one of the most amazing things in the whole world. All the great literature of the world taken to this one library in Alexandria, and then it burned to the ground, and people like me, I just still feel sad about that. But all this great literature compiled in one place, and he's like, hey, we need to compile all the stuff you Christians believe, put it into one. So the Septuagint is written, 381 AD. So about 100 years later, now you have what's called the Vulgate is written. The Vulgate was now translated into Latin. Latin was a pretty common language of the people, especially the Romans. It's called a common language or the vulgar language. Now pay attention to this for a second, because one of the things that people argue about through the centuries is whether or not the Bible should be translated into another language. Your purists say this should not be translated because in order for it to be true, it has to stay in this language. Then we translate the next one, and then that group of people says, don't translate it again, because it won't be true if you translate it. The next group of people, don't translate it again, because it won't be true if you translate it. This happens throughout all of history. You'll see it over and over again. So in this case, they're like, oh my gosh, you're going to make a vulgar version of the Bible. And they hire this guy, St. Jerome. I don't know if he was hired or he had to die if he didn't do it. But St. Jerome, by the way, you know where he's writing? Because I've been there. He writes in the cave where Jesus was born. I mean, if you got to be inspired, not a bad place. So under the Church of the Nativity, in the cave where they believe Jesus was born, St. Jerome translates the Bible into the Vulgate. Now, catch this. This is 381 AD. The Catholic Church uses this version of the Bible until the 20th century. Not bad, St. Jerome. 635 AD. You have this sect of Christians, because they have unique beliefs, called the Nestorian Christians. Well, they wind up traveling to China. Lo and behold, the Hebrew Scriptures are translated into Chinese for the first time, and we find a limestone block that has the Hebrew Scriptures in Chinese, 635 AD. 862 AD, you have your first Slavic Bible from the church in Thessalonica. Interesting. So Thessalonians, when you read 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, two guys, Cyril and Methodius, two brothers, one was a governor, one was a philosopher, teacher. They both feel called to go and learn another language, translate the Bible into that language. There's a massive political thing about it, because they're invited by a prince who's actually trying to consolidate his power. There are these other Christians that are trying to, it's a kind of a bit of a power struggle. They get pushed out, but they wind up achieving their goal. They translate the Bible into a Slavic version of the Bible, and it takes root in Poland, Bulgaria, and Russia. Fast forward, 1380 AD. We get what's called the Wycliffe Bible. Now this is significant because what happens, do we have any Marvel Universe fans? Any superhero fans? Do we have Avengers, Endgame, all that? Okay. So you go, oh, that was really creative of those guys. They just imagine, like, what if you killed off half the population? Actually, they were just importing something that happened in history. There's this thing called the Black Plague. It killed off almost half of the population. So I want you to imagine half the population of Nashville is dead within a year or two. This is the world they live in. Now, the church As soon as the Black Plague starts happening, right? People start dying. Just see if you've heard of this before. A couple people start dying, Black Plague, the pagan people. Church gets up. God's judgment is being revealed. You people who don't follow God, God is killing you. This is his judgment on the earth. A few more pagan people die. Next thing you know, lots more pagan people die. Next thing you know, a bunch of church people die. Bishops, cardinals, all the big dogs who were saying it was God's judgment, they're all dead too. Now the people in the pews are like, so is God judging you too? So think about it. The craftsmen, the thinkers, the writers, half of the population is dead. And people are left to despair, like, what do we think about God? No one had their own personal Bible. The only way you heard from the Bible was when someone read it from the Latin Vulgate in a church service. So this guy, John Wycliffe, begins to handwrite a translation from Latin to English, and you have the first Wycliffe Bible. And now people can begin to read the Bible for themselves. And what happens? Another political problem, because now the Catholic Church is like, people shouldn't be reading it on their own because they're going to have too much freedom to interpret it on their own. They should trust us to control their lives. They're so angry about it. Wycliffe is dead for 44 years, and they order the bones of his body to be dug up, crushed, and scattered in the river. Just to make a point. Meanwhile, there's 9 crusades that happen. The church sends Christians out to kill Muslim, Jews, and pagans unless they convert at the tip of a sword. People are confused about Christianity. In response to desperate search for answers, they want to try and read their own Bible. Well, in 1450, an invention that changes the trajectory of the human race, Johannes Gutenberg invents the printing press. And now, for the first time, the Vulgate is mass-produced in English. You can read the Bible for yourself. Now, it takes a few hundred years to catch on. The Tyndale Bible in 1525 is created, and then in 1534, Martin Luther takes the Bible and translates the whole Bible into Germanic language, which, intentionally or unintentionally, winds up uniting Germany for the first time because they have all these tribes and the kind of variations of language, but he puts it all in one place where now everyone uses the Bible as a way to learn a common language. 1560, you have the Geneva Bible. William Shakespeare, John Milton, this would have been the Bible they would be referring to influence their own writing. And then, in 1611, along comes this other translation called the King James Bible. This happens because Queen Elizabeth dies, and this guy named King James takes the throne. Now, the Puritans at the time, or Presbyterians, are pretty thrilled because they think King James will be on their side. He comes from this Scottish world, and so they have a big council, and they say, King James, we are tired of having just this one pope guy, this one head guy in front of the whole church. That's not good. We got a new plan. We think you should have committees. And the committees should run the church. And we're here now, that you're our new king, to make that decree, no more one pope, give us committees. King James goes, are you freaking kidding me? I was in Scotland. The committee thing was a disaster. All you guys did was argue and squabble about everything. I'm not doing that. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to reinforce the other thing. Good, we got a pope. Listen to him. Well, the Puritan, that didn't go well. So the Puritan guy, props to him, pivots in the moment. He goes, okay, look, if we don't get authority that way, could we at least have one common translation? Because there's all these variations. You know, we got this Wycliffe thing and the Geneva thing and just kind of these different translations the Bible's bouncing about. Could we consolidate into like one Bible that you decree is the right one? That's a pretty good compromise. I like what you're thinking there. Let's do it. So he brings a bunch of scholars together, and they create what's called the King James Bible. Another interesting thing about the King James Bible, it was not written for people to have their own personal devotions. The desire was still for them to gather as a community and listen to it read to them orally. So one of his charges that he says to the scholars, when you interpret this, I need you to interpret this so that it sounds good when it's read out loud. So it has this kind of meter to it. It has this rhythm. It has this poetic structure to it, which is why, if you've ever been in a hotel room and had a moment like, I think I'd like to read my Bible. You open up the drawer and pull out your Bible. It was left there by the Gideons, and you whip open your King James Bible. And you go, ooh, that's a bit of a tough slog. Like, Thee, thouest thing. Yep, maybe I got something in my app. Like it's tough. It wasn't meant to be read in 1611, personally, let alone now. But if you ever, occasionally I'll pull out the King James Version because I want to read it out loud because it does have something really beautiful the way it sounds when you read it out loud. It's got this just great meter to it on purpose because it was designed that way. 1800, William Carey goes to India. He translates the Bible into Bengali and Sanskrit. 1887, the Korean Bible is formed. The Koreans don't like the word God. They don't think you should say the word God. So God is removed from the Bible. Instead, they replace it with ruler of heaven and earth. In 1942, you have Wycliffe Bible Translators, an organization that says, if we're going to preserve the Bible for civilization, let's take it to the ends of the earth. What about these small tribes, other places that have never heard the story of God? We'd like to take it to them. And so they begin a translation project, which is ongoing to this day, where they go to every tribe, every nation, and they're attempting to translate the Bible into their language so that they can understand the written story of God. All right, see if you caught any themes. Let me make one more observation. Wycliffe Bible translators say that it takes about 5 years to go into a tribe, learn its stories, its cultural mores, its nuances, build relationship before you even talk about who Jesus is in the context of Scripture. About 5 years. Then it takes another 2 years to be able to take their language and then present it back to them orally to tell them the love story of God. It takes 20 years to then compile that into a written work. So what do you hear in all of that? He who is good soil, you'll understand the word. What do you hear in this? Do you hear time, process, relationship? I don't know how we get around the Bible being a relational book. Most of the Bible is written in story form. And then when you get to the closest thing that's kind of propositional truth is the closest thing to kind of doctrinal, written in almost a doctrinal way, is Paul. But what is he doing? He's writing to real people in real time. And then the story of the Bible being translated is the story of people groups and their culture. It's a relational book. Some of what hurt us after the Enlightenment, there are some beautiful things that happen when the Enlightenment, I'm going to just scale the whole Enlightenment down to like one sentence, which is, I realize, not highly advantageous. But after the Enlightenment, we basically were like, hey, I don't think it's good to have other people tell us what to do and to just live in our tribal way of thinking. Can we think for ourselves? Enlightenment. There's something about that that's quite beautiful, right? Okay, good. Don't just do what other people tell you to do. At the same time, let's acknowledge a truth that there's something about let me think for myself that's not really accurate. Have you ever looked at somebody maybe even said, oh, it's really cool, that person's starting to think from themselves. They shook free from their family or from that cult or from that weird thing. And, they're starting to think for themselves. It's not really true, though, is it? Like, they didn't start thinking for themselves. They just started thinking with different people. So they got different perspective. They started to see the world differently. And they started to go, oh, maybe what I thought was this is not this. There's really a fascinating story, Washington Post or New York Times, on, if you've heard of Westboro Baptist, or the people that carry around the picketing signs that says God hates fags and all. That's what they're known for. That's they own the website. And if you've probably heard about them in the news. There's a fascinating story. I think it's the daughter of the founder, but it's someone who is in the center group, and she tells the story about how a Jewish man, started to be kind to her, and it began to unravel her thinking, because it messed her up. Because she was like, well, this guy's he's going to hell. He's supposed to burn, but he was kind to her, and it messed with her. So the only thing she could do was she changed she stopped putting that sign up and put a different sign up and stopped talking to him. That's a threat, but I also feel like something's messed with me. What happens over time? You start to pull the thread, she starts asking new questions and starts listening to some other voices, and you go, oh, she's starting to think for herself. No, she's starting to think with different people. And it's beginning to shape the way she sees the world. It's how all of us function. So let's just acknowledge this is true. This is why I say to you all the time, you are who you hang out with. Be selective who you spend your time with, because it's influencing you, whether you know it or not. That includes your authors. That includes your news channel. That includes your blogs. Includes the people. Relationship matters. Most revelation is not found in something you measure, but in someone you meet. Take that in for just a second, because again, post-enlightenment, we leave our heart at the door, we check our relationships to the side, and instead we just get lost in our head and we say, I've got to figure this out and analyze this truth. And if I can analyze this truth, then I can prove that I'm right. Then I can build a bastion of rightness, tell you that you're wrong, open the door for the few people that are right with me, and we will continue to build layers, make our tower stronger, that our abstract truth, separated sometimes from people, disconnected from anyone different, so that we can live in our rightness. Most of those people, if you really check in with them, are terribly insecure. Your average person who lives their life like that, they're just full of fear. And you know, if you go, what, I need to probably study more, right, so I can debate them, you can. But probably what they need more than anything is just love. Because it's the only thing that ultimately displaces fear. Perfect love, what happens? Casts out fear. So instead of, I know it's easy to be frustrated and angry with highly judgmental people that are obsessed with being right all the time. But instead, just if we can look at them with compassion and say they're probably building something out of fear, how do I come to them with compassion? There's things that are just hidden. They just don't see it yet. Jesus summarizes Matthew 13 after that parable. We get this summary. Actually, Matthew's summarizing what happens after this. Jesus tells the story. He says this, verse 34. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables, and I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. You hear the paradox? Wait, he's talking about it. So, isn't it revealed? Things hidden. The divine is both completely hidden and perfectly revealed at the same time. This is the story of God. He is on display everywhere. But it's hidden unless we have the decoder. And where do we experience the decoder? Only one place, in the dance of the Trinity. A relational God. And when we place ourselves in relationship with God, the Spirit of God illuminates our world and lets us see what we couldn't see. I was sitting with a dear friend of mine this week. We had lunch, and he was processing out loud some of his story. And he got to a part of his story, and suddenly it was like if I could split the air and open up a whole portal to another dimension. It happened right there at the lunch table. And he got lost in some emotion that hit him, but he was having this revelation of truth about his own story. And I got chills now, remember it. And it was undeniable we were in the presence of God. Now, were we not in the presence of God before that? Nope. We were in the presence of God. It was just hidden. And for a brief moment, for both of us, it was no longer hidden. It was perfectly revealed. You could feel the love just hanging over our table. What happened? We were interacting with a transcendent. You try and put words to it. It felt sacred. We were walking in the Spirit. We were trying to language something that's beyond us. It's a deep mystery. It's the kingdom. But it's revealed. Angie and I went over, we saw the boys, stopped by the boys' house yesterday, and they were playing some of their music for us, and Jordan goes, you got to hear this one song by my friend Jordy. He plays this song by Jordy Searcy called Better. And I put it on the screen for you. And we listened to the song, and I'm like, all of us were like, oh my gosh. Just chills. And we're like, this dude has lived some life. Like, you can feel in this song, you feel his pain, but you can also feel something sacred in it. Like, he just, one of those rare songs where a guy captured something. And you feel it. When you're tuned in, you always know you're in the presence of truth. It's a deep knower. You're like, and sometimes physically you're like, oh, I got chills, or I got tears, or you just can tell something's going on. What is it? You're in the glory of God. And it just is on display different ways. If we have eyes to see, if the soil is good. So let me close with this. Many of us started learning the Bible like it was some kind of cosmic SAT test. If I get the right answers, maybe God will like me. But God's love is not contingent upon us being clever. As Rohr says it, but in one of God's favorite and most effective hiding places, humility. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? If you're journaling, keep journaling, or otherwise stare at the floor, close your eyes, whatever helps you focus. Just do a quick check-in with you. What kind of soil? What's your heart like? Is it hard? So when that seed lands, it's just going to bounce off? Have you surrounded yourself with thorns? People that are not speaking life into you? Are you immersed in the worries of the ego, fear and anxiety? So when the seed comes, it starts for a minute, but the joy is just squelched. Or right now, right here in this moment, you go, no, I'm open, I'm ready, I'm available. The soil has been tilled. God has done some work. There has been some scraping, some digging. As a matter of fact, there's been some burning in my life. And this land has been prepared. The landscape of my heart is ready to receive. I show up in a posture of humility. This is not about me being right. It's about me being loved. That's the only thing that's going to release me from the fear that drives me. So if you're in that place today, would you just receive it?